How would you frame the problem that the book tries to address? We have limited time, finite lives, unlimited number of tasks, dreams and hobbies, and on and on and on. There's a clash. We can't do it all. How would you frame it?
I mean, yeah, I think that you put that very well. I think the thing that I write about in both my most recent book and in 4,000 Weeks really is this mismatch between the sort of infinite standards we're capable of imagining for what we do and the infinite amount of stuff we're capable of imagining, the infinite number of obligations that we can feel, ambitions we can harbor, and then the sort of material reality of being human animals who can only do so much and are going to die and can only be in one place at a time. And, you know, and I think that a lot of what we do when it comes to what gets called time management and productivity and lots of other things as well is really an attempt to kind of psychologically escape this truth, right? It's an attempt to kind of not feel what it's like to be a finite human.
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on the show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. My guest today is Oliver Burkeman. He's the New York Times and UK Sunday Times bestselling author of 4,000 Weeks and the newly released Meditations for Mortals, 4 Weeks to Embrace Your Limitations and Make Time for What Counts. He writes about productivity, mortality, the power of limits, and building a meaningful life in an age of distraction. After a decade in Brooklyn, he now lives in the UK. Oliver, so nice to see you. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for inviting me for this conversation.
Well, you know that I love both books, and I found myself rereading the first one as I was reading the second one, and I was looking forward to this conversation. And I want to be respectful of your time, so let's just jump right in, since Sure. I have many, many questions. I want to ask you about the early days. I want to ask you about childhood and upbringing, and how you think that time shaped you, shaped your relationship with time, and the career path that you chose.
Wow, yeah. I mean, it's a sort of endless mystery, isn't it? Each of our childhoods. I the sort of brief surface story. Anyway, I was born in the city of Liverpool in England, but I grew up mostly in a city called York, and I come from a background of sort of, really quite secular, but I was raised as a Quaker. And then my family is Jewish on my father's side, which I think is also a sort of strand that's present in my psychology. And in terms of what writing and journalism, I think that I just sort of wanted to write for newspapers since almost as early as I could remember. I was definitely sort of making my classmates read little printed, photocopied things I'd created on a typewriter when I was, I don't know, probably 9 or 10. I think I thought of the newspaper that sort of sat on the breakfast table as the source of all authority in the world and the place to go for all the understanding of the way life really was. And, you know, as a result of that and other personality traits to do with being very sort of focused and able to do academic work and things like that, I think I sort of got to that point quite quickly in my young adulthood. But even, you know, I think the other layer of this, and I don't know how much this is down to childhood, I feel like overwhelmingly, I feel like I had a very, very sort of happy and gentle childhood, but it obviously gave me something about the idea of productivity and the idea of needing to prove my worth through output. I can't deny that, looking at, you know, for example, how sort of anxious I then became when I went to university and I was, you know, I'd been this, I think it's a very familiar experience. You sort of sail through high school because you find it very easy to be at the top of the class in things, and then you find yourself at university where everybody there was the top of their classes, and suddenly it's horrifyingly competitive, and you don't know how you're ever going to keep your head above water. And that was my first sort of experience of, a real kind of struggle with, you know, not overtly with time, but it is about time. It is about, like, how am I going to use these days before this examination in order to be in the best situation, and how terrible is it going to be if I don't do well in this examination. I don't think I understood very much about what was going on with me psychologically then. I think that came a lot later. But and then I sort of, after a few wrong turns into trying to be an academic, I set off on a career path to become a journalist. I could go on for hours in this way, and I think it would be extremely boring. So let me stop there and ask you
I think
what you wanted to ask about.
You've dropped a lot of hints throughout your books about those early days, and I will come back throughout this conversation. So, but I think you framed it beautifully for the time being, those early days. And I think we're all praised for accomplishments and productivity, both at school and then in the early years of our professional life. And we may get lost in it. And that's how I was reading your book, and I was looking for answers for myself as well. And I'm sure the audience will be looking for the answers for themselves. How would you frame the problem that the book tries to address? We have limited time, finite lives, a limited number of tasks, dreams and hobbies, and on and on and on. There's a clash. We can't do it all. How would you frame it?
I mean, yeah, I think that you put that very well. I think the sort of the thing that I write about in both my most recent book and in 4,000 Weeks really is this mismatch between the sort of infinite standards we're capable of imagining for what we do, and the infinite amount of stuff we're capable of imagining, the infinite number of obligations that we can feel, ambitions we can harbor, and then the sort of material reality of being human animals who can only do so much and are going to die and can only be in one place at a time. And, you know, if you were a sort of a non-human animal, then it would be fine because you wouldn't have these ideas. And if you were God, it would be fine because you would be able to put them all into practice. But we're like stuck in the middle of being able to sort of have these conceptions and not put them into practice. So life is a sort of an inherent process of sacrifice and choice and trade-off and decision-making and all the rest of it. And I think that a lot of what we do when it comes to what gets called time management and productivity and lots of other things as well, is really an attempt to kind of psychologically escape this truth, right? It's an attempt to
Right.
kind of not feel what it's like to be a finite human. So if you're feeling like, very pressured at work and that you need to sort of feel that you need to do twice as much as you currently do, and deep down you feel like you're not even an adequate human being if you can't get to that level, and then you see some book or some course that says like, here's how to 10x your productivity, that's like, okay, this is my way out. This is my way to a place of peace and feeling okay about what I'm doing, and then you sort of start pursuing that. But my premise, well, the first part of my premise is that is never going to work, because there's, even if you 10x your productivity, you'll then just feel the pressure to 100x your productivity, right? That's how it works. And secondly, that actually and this is a very important part of this for me to emphasize, because I think sometimes people, when I talk about this stuff anyway, people don't always pick up on this, but acknowledging these limitations and stepping more fully into that sort of conscious engagement with limitation is like, this is a path to being more meaningfully productive. This is not about like saying, we can't do it, so let's just give up, right? It's precisely when you let these completely impossible ambitions of doing literally everything, or ever more, or optimizing sufficiently, which is not a point that will ever be reached. It's when you relax that a little bit or let it fall that you can pour your time and energy and attention into doing the things that really matter to you in your life. So I have found this to be a very sort of motivational and energizing and empowering path, even though it begins with this sort of huge bummer of having to accept the reality of being finite.
Early in your book, and it rhymes with what you just said, there's this thought-provoking but freeing declaration. I called it the acceptance of failure in a way. And you say, it's worse than you think, when it seems as though the life you envisioned for yourself might never come to fruition after all. The magic behind begins when you understand that it definitely won't come to fruition. It's a certain acceptance that you will never be done. You will never read the last book you thought you're going to read. You'll never finish the last task you thought you could finish. And it shakes you up reading it in your book. And I know it's true, but reading it shakes you up a little bit when you realize, I think Oliver is onto something. I might never be. and you can tell that I've used all tools possible, and I have efficient task lists and everything else. And I have this realization that they will never be completely done and empty.
Right. Yes. And there is so much liberation, and as I say, also focus and motivation in really allowing that truth to kind of permeate you. I think that idea of like, it's worse than you think, and why that's great is, for me, this has been really powerful, right? Because, one example that I give there, right, is if you think that imposter syndrome is an example of this, right? If you go through your life feeling like there's a level of experience and expertise and sort of confidence that you've got to achieve that everyone else in your industry or whatever has already achieved and you haven't, and that's why you're the fraud, and you've got to work really, really hard for it. It's going to be really difficult, but you could get there. That's a very agonizing way to live. But if you see that it's worse than you think, and that actually nobody ever feels ready to do new things in life or to enter new stages of life, right? It's like, it's by definition that we are all winging it all the time. That's great news, right? In that shift from very difficult to impossible, that shift from like, it's going to be very difficult to feel like I know what I'm doing, to what if I never know what I'm doing? It's like a burden is lifted, and you're like, well, I might as well just do some things now, right? Instead of waiting, postponing life for this time when it's all come together and I'm feeling fully in control.
There's this image, and I don't remember which philosopher shared it, about the circle of competence. It's used as a term in the investment profession, how you want to expand your circle of competence. I manage money for families, so I'm familiar with the concept. But somebody pointed out to me that once the circle gets bigger, yes, you know more, but the space around that circle gets even bigger because you're
Perimeter,
touching.
yeah, right, yeah.
Because then you're even more aware of how much you don't know, right? So I think that's the point in your book with a lot of those pursuits, that the harder you work, the more tasks you complete, the faster you get with replying to emails. Guess what? More emails will come.
Yeah. And this is not to say that there's no benefit to expanding your circle of expertise. This is not to say that there's no benefit to getting more effective at answering more emails, because that might suit your purposes. The problem is thinking that you're going to get to this point where it saves you, right? It's that idea that, like, eventually I'm going to get to the point where I can finally relax. You have to relax now in the middle of the chaos if you're going to relax ever.
There's a concept that you introduced that really resonated with me. You called it productivity debt. And the way I hear it, and I'm curious how you think about it, is that you wake up in the morning and you have to work your way back from some sort of a debt that got accumulated because you enjoyed an 8-hour night of sleep. What is it, this productivity debt, and how do we get there? Because it wasn't always the case, and how do you recommend that we address it? Because I think a lot of us experience that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really targeting this feeling that I wrote about earlier in other places, and people really, it was very clear that I wasn't alone, that, that you wake up in the morning and you've sort of got to earn your right to be present on the planet in some sense. And the very best you can hope for if the day goes perfectly is that you get back to zero balance, like that would be a really good day. You'd get back to zero, then you'd go to bed, and in the morning you'd be in debt again, and you'd have to do it all again. And as I say in the book, obviously, if you work for money, there is a narrow sense in which you do owe productivity to whoever is paying you your salary or whatever it is. But this existential sense that you don't quite deserve to exist unless you've reached a certain level of output, I think it's it's one of those things that is sort of overdetermined, right? You can blame the Protestant work ethic in Anglo-American culture. You can blame prevalent parenting styles in the schooling system. You can certainly blame, certain dynamics in capitalism. There are so many different ways you can do that. But I think at the very root of all of those things always is just that we are on some level aware of our mortality, right? We on some level don't want to die, and we think that by some kind of proving ourselves, we can sort of gain a more secure foothold on the planet than in fact we ever will have. I think just seeing this phenomenon is very powerful. A lot of people find that, just noticing that's what you're doing is quite interesting, because intellectually I don't think I've got to do a certain amount of stuff in my day to earn my right to exist. Like that's not I don't agree with that viewpoint. To realize that that's how I'm behaving is quite powerful. And I suggest in the book an incredibly simple intervention, which is just keeping a done list, right? Just keeping a list of things that you do as you accomplish them through the day, alongside whatever other task management system you may choose to have or not. There is just something very powerful in the idea that one of the things you're doing as you go through the day is sort of curating a list of things that you did as compared to zero, right? As compared to what if you hadn't even got out of bed that morning.
Right.
Because otherwise all that's going to happen is you're just going to naturally compare what you've done to the infinite amount that you haven't yet done. And if you compare yourself to an infinite standard, you never feel good as a result, right? So that's just a very simple thing. I think, there may be people in the audience here realizing that a lot of religion is an attempt to answer this problem, right? There are certainly people who would say, well, My answer to this is that I believe in an all-loving, benevolent God who values me regardless of what I do. These kind of ideas of religion, and in some sense, I think I am navigating that kind of terrain from the position of someone who finds that I just, I can only believe what I believe, so I have to find ways through this that work for me and that work for a secular age. But these are sort of religious questions on some level.
Mm-hmm. I like the idea that we deserve to be here, even if we do absolutely nothing today. And I'm trying to get through that mindset. It's an aspiration. Oliver, you tell a story of a certain stroll in Paris 100 years ago. And that story resonated with me. I'll bring it up in here because it's a couple walking around. They meet somebody who read about something that's happening on the other side of the globe, and it's somebody that's very upset about the troubles of people on the other side of the globe. And it's a story from 100 years ago, but I was thinking today we have even more sources of information from around the globe coming to us every single minute. Our pockets are vibrating, our watches on the wrists are vibrating. How do we manage it? And it was a problem 100 years ago, and today it's even worse.
I think this is a really interesting aspect of all this, because when you talk about to-do lists and how being busy and overwhelmed, I think most people tend to focus on, the tasks of the day and personal and business domains. But I think for a lot of people in a world that feels to be involved in so many sort of multiple interlocking crises at the moment and so much sort of suffering that, as you say, in earlier eras we wouldn't even have heard of, we wouldn't have known it was happening. A lot of people feel that that's another part of their it's a different part of the to-do list, right? To do what you can, to be a good citizen of this kind of, in this kind of world, to make a difference if you can, whether through your philanthropy or your activism or your writing or whatever it is. And it's sort of unmanageable. The story that you refer to is about the French philosopher Raymond Aron strolling in Paris and running into the sort of Catholic Jewish mystic, she was a philosopher as well, Simone Weil, who in many ways was an extraordinarily admirable person, right? A kind of a saint. And I'm not saying what she was doing was bad. I'm just saying I couldn't do it without going crazy. And what she's doing is like everyone's enjoying themselves on this beautiful sunny day except Simone Weil, who is in tears because, as she puts it to Raymond Aron when he asks what's wrong, there's a general strike in Shanghai and the troops have opened fire on the workers. And he tells this anecdote to imply like there's something about being at least a regular kind of human, which I don't think I think she was a very unusual person, but that really requires you to be able to put up some boundaries there and to see that you are in a beautiful garden in the middle of Paris, and definitely to care about things that are happening in the rest of the world, but not to become a kind of just completely overwhelmed by the amount of suffering that there always is in the world. And the sort of place I take that in that chapter of the book is also to say, I think that even if you're going to make a big difference to the suffering in the world and the crises in the world, you still need, in the world in which we live, to be able to sort of put most of them aside. Mm-hmm. Because if you make it your business to sort of get your arms around all of it, you will be much less effective and much more prone to the kind of performative. This is a thing that did not have happened 100 years ago in Paris, right? The idea that like it might be something, it might make a difference for you to just sort of change your avatar on social media. That would be changing that would be making a difference to an instance of suffering. So I think we got to take this appreciation for our finitude seriously in our jobs, in our life outside work, and also in our work as citizens.
And again, it's a similar harsh realization that we just can't take it all on us because it's just too much. And actually, the more connected we are, the more news we get. And actually, these days, people can self-report about what's going on in different parts of the world before the official media even arrives. So you might know about a fire, an earthquake, or something happening just because you're paying attention to social media. There's just too much to care. And I think one of the things we can do is just focus on the handful of causes that we can pay attention to and take care of. I want to ask you about the future. You talk about the future, and there's this quote that I really like. You say, never let the future disturb you. You will meet it, if you have to, with the same weapons of reason which today arm you against the present. We spend so much time thinking about the future, and there's so much worry and concern about it. When it comes, it comes, and you basically tell us you'll be able to handle it. Can you talk more about that future that we spend too much time thinking about?
Yeah, that quotation is a translation of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and it's a sort of a lovely way of crystallizing the point I want to make in that section, which is one of the crucial ways in which we are limited as humans. It's harder to see than some of the other ways, but is that we're sort of temporally limited, right? We're stuck here in the present. We can't just peer over the top of the fence and just check that everything's going to be fine in the future. Of course, we can engage in forecasting. Of course, we can engage in judicious behavior to maximize the chances of things going well, but we can't know what the future holds. And so that phrase about that you should, that we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, is like one of those incredibly strangely powerful things. It's like it's when I really began to think about that phrase, I realized how much of my life I spent attempting to cross bridges before I came to them, right? To sort of think through all eventualities and know that if I came across them, I would be able to manage. I mean, this is simply not something that a temporally limited human can do. And I think what Marcus Aurelius is saying in that quotation as well is sort of right here, right now, you are in this wild world dealing with all sorts of issues and problems and your own limitations and other people's issues, and you're managing, right? By definition, you are here, you are managing. You might even be enjoying it. You might even be having quite a few moments of happiness in your life. And yet somehow we assume by default that if bad things happen in the future, we'll just we can't trust ourselves to respond properly to them then. So it's like we place insufficient trust in our future selves and sort of too much trust in our present selves to think through all the eventualities. And I think what I take him to be saying is just like, no, demonstrably, you're a person of resources who's capable of dealing with the slings and arrows of life. So maybe work on the assumption that when other ones happen in the future, you will still be that person instead of like suddenly becoming a completely incompetent wreck or something.
When the problems arrive, we'll be ready for them. There are moments when I'm thinking, and maybe it's the investor head or a personality in me, I'm thinking of the things I can do today that I will be appreciative in the future that I did them. And just to be playful here, I'm thinking of an instant coffee and a rice cooker. Like, I forgot to make coffee, I can make instant coffee in an instant, right? But if you want to have rice with your dinner, a rice cooker needs 45 minutes to cook that rice. So it pays to remember, we'll need rice with dinner tonight. Let's set it up, right? So there are elements to the future where obviously there's so much that's completely unpredictable. But there are some things like planting a tree to have the shade in front of your house when you retire, or putting some money away in savings so that you do have some money down the road for a down payment on the house. So I like this play of, if I have control over it and I can do it today, sometimes it's worth doing it. And there's so much that I have no control over. I'll have to handle it when it comes.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic that sort of speaks to another part of the book, right? Which is that absolutely, this is not a manifesto against wise investment or against setting up the rice cooker. I would add that if you want good coffee, you have to give that a little bit of time to brew. In my experience, instant coffee won't cut it. So in all sorts of ways, we live and use time instrumentally for the future. Of course we do. And we should, and that's great. What I want to say here is that it is possible to go too far in this direction, right? it is possible. I'm sure you know people in the investment world who seem to, but it's not only there, but it's prone to it perhaps, to sort of deny themselves happiness or fulfillment that could exist now in the present because they are so completely invested in in setting things up for the future, right? This is the classic sort of Ebenezer Scrooge kind of idea. And I sort of experiment with this notion that if you're interested in this material in the first place, if you're kind of thinking about these issues, like it's a good bet that you're a little bit too good at deferring gratification in life rather than a little bit bad, right? There are definitely people who are so sort of impulse driven and short-term horizon that they should do with a bit more thinking about their future selves. But there are quite a lot of us who could do with a little bit more realization that, present self matters as well. And ultimately, in some sort of spiritual sense, it's just present self, right? Now, and it'll be present self later. So I bring up that idea about the famous marshmallow experiments that I'm sure you know about, right? Where children who have the self-discipline to resist a marshmallow and wait 10 minutes to get a second marshmallow have much better life outcomes, according to this experiment. And it's like, that's true. And also, I mean, it's contested actually in the literature, but let's assume it's true. That's true. And also, at some point, you have to eat marshmallows. Otherwise, there's no point.
What's the point?
Collecting marshmallows. I think this overlaps. I don't know if you know this book, Die with Zero. Have you come across this?
Yes.
Right. Yes. I don't know what you make of that book, but I think that part of its ethos, I've only looked a little bit inside it, is sort of it's taking this idea and exploring it more fully in the kind of financial and personal financial realm. It is possible to put too much money away and to fail to take to fail to have the amazing experience until you're too old to have the experience, or until you're dead.
You talk about this idea of not being too kind to the future self in your book. And there are books about future self. Hal Hershfield wrote a wonderful book about it. But I think you're making an interesting point, because there are people that don't think about the future self at all. So introducing them to the idea that there is a future self waiting there, and that future self might be grateful that you did something today. But people that already talk about future selves, I think you have a great point that they might be a bit too obsessed about that future self.
Right. I mean, look, if you're not interested in productivity, and you're not interested in how to structure your life, and you're not interested in investment, and you're not interested in any of this stuff, then maybe you're not listening to this conversation, right? But if you are interested in one of those or more of those things, then it's at least a possibility that actually what you need the as a sort of balance in your life is a more presentist focus.
And I think it's a good point that if we have a tendency throughout life with those marshmallows, by the age of 40, 50, we get so good at it that we may as well never enjoy the marshmallow because we're so good at saving it. And I think there's a lesson there that wakes us up in the book you mentioned. Die with Zero is one of those wake-up calls that maybe some things are worth enjoying now instead of in 40 years, and so on. I work with clients that inherited wealth in many cases, and the book Die with Zero has this one idea in there that I think gets lost, that if you choose to really die with zero, so to speak, he actually suggests that you could gift whatever you choose to gift to your kids early on, not when you pass away. You could actually exclude it from your net worth sooner. And I think there's a whole other topic, but I think it's interesting to think that you're thinking not just about your future self, but your kids and so on. So if you're not going to eat the marshmallow, there are other people that might enjoy that marshmallow in your family. Separate topic. Oliver, I want to ask you about the magic of completion. What is it, and why it's important?
There is something that I and others have found very, very powerful in finishing things. There's a coach and writer called Steve Chandler, who I quote in the book, who points out that, like, you'd expect that if you decided you were going to finish all these open loops in your life, you were going to take all these projects that needed completing and complete them, you'd expect that would leave you drained, right? It's like, I've got to go back to that and finish this and finish that. It's not true, right? There is this strange energy that is released by completing things. I think we don't realize how draining and distracting it is to go through our days trailing this kind of long list of incomplete, unfinished tasks and projects. And there's something really powerful in bringing them to completion. I think the reason for this is that, in a sense, it's a little bit difficult to put into words, but in a sense what we're doing is we are sort of falling into the groove of what reality really is, right? Which is that each moment is complete in itself, right? That is what it is to be human. You can't really, some part of you may be not finishing projects because you feel that keeping all these things open somehow puts you in more control, or that if you were to finish them, you would be sort of letting go of control of them and sending them out into the world. It depends on the project, obviously. And actually, in fact, getting into this groove of finishing things is a truly motivating and sort of satisfying way to work. And the trick, as I point out in that section, is that like you can just redefine what finishing is, right? If it's, I'll give an example from my own life, right? I'm not going to put finish the book on my list and then sort of postpone any sort of satisfaction or sense of progress until I've finished a whole book. I'm going to put, I'm going to define the project that I'm finishing as coming up with a one-pager that shows the structure of chapter 2.
Right.
And I'm going to do it, and I'm going to complete it, and then it's going to be off my plate, and then I'm going to move on in sequence to the next thing. And it's possible to sort of, by sort of lowering the scale of what counts as completion, it's possible to sort of re-engineer your working day as just a sort of sequence of completions. There's a lot of work been done on the kind of motivating power of so-called small wins, right? Which is closely related to this. I think it's also really important to say that consciously deciding to abandon something is also completion, right? So it's not that you have to finish everything you start, but it is that you have to, if you're going to abandon something, you have to be like, okay, I'm abandoning this project. I'm not sort of keeping it hanging around there. I think that having a list of sort of 50 open projects, it's very draining, but it is sort of like a hedge against mortality in some way, right? Because I think on some very strange level of our psyche, we say, well, look, if I've got all these things still to do, it must be that I'm going to have the lifetime left to do them, and that sort of life is going to stretch on and on. And I quote this author Sarah Manguso saying that like she realizes that she's afraid that if she finishes all the things in her work in progress file, she's afraid she'll die, because like there is that strange relationship between like keeping things open and finishing them. So I think it's really empowering, a little bit nerve-wracking sometimes, but really empowering to get into the swing of finishing instead.
I like the idea of breaking up a bigger project into small pieces, because it feels like you can complete a lot of them sooner, not waiting until the entire project is done. And I really like this idea of not finishing. And it took me years to develop the skill or the practice or the discipline to drop some things. And whether it's investment research, when I already spent so much time on a stock and I feel like this is not going anywhere. And it's as hard to walk away from it as to keep going.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you have to say, I think my time belongs somewhere else and I can move on. It applies to books. I start so many books, and yours I read twice. So I think there's a big reason behind it and a huge endorsement. But it's easier for me these days to drop something that I'm not interested in and just move on. I want to ask you about an idea that I've heard once or twice before. You bring up the concept of working for 3 to 4 hours a day, and you bring up historical figures that did a lot of research, writing, very creative individuals across history, that if you actually look closer, they worked for 3 to 4 hours a day. They devoted just a small chunk of the day to really, really work. Can you talk about it and how we can maybe apply it? Because we have this model of working 9 to 5 or 9 to 9, whatever it is, but we're actually productive for a much shorter period of time.
Yeah, I think this applies specifically, the research suggests, and certainly that all that anecdotal evidence suggests, this applies to sort of work that requires deep thought. Different limitations apply if you're, doing manual work, or kind of certain kinds of white collar work that do not require sort of deep engagement, usually solo with ideas and with thinking. But if that's the kind of thing you do, and all these examples in the book come from, composers and artists and authors and mathematicians and people, and I'm sure it applies to things like investment research as well, although I don't know the firsthand. This 3 to 4 hour limit seems to be quite real. It seems to be much more effective to sort of, and productive over the long term, to accept that limit and to work with it instead of, every single day trying to push yourself beyond those limits with all the expected effects of like loss of effective work and then gradual burnout. And now, obviously, a lot of these characters in history could then just like do nothing else because they had multiple domestic staff to do things, and that possibly that's true for some of the people you interact with. I don't know, but it's not true for very many of us. And I'm not really making the argument that you can just do 4 hours work and then stop. I'm saying that you shouldn't really be beating yourself up if it's no more than 3 or 4 hours is given to the sort of the core deep work. The other thing that I think is important about this is that to safeguard that time in a day usually requires quite a bit of forethought and discipline, and you need to run your diary or schedule in such a way that those hours are free. And if you try to, I believe that if you try to exert more than about that much control over your day, right? If you try to ring fence and defend more than about 3 or 4 hours, it very rapidly enters the world of diminishing returns because,
Right.
You need to be available for certain people. You need to be able to make certain calls. You need to be open to serendipitous encounters. You might want to sort of break off work and hang out with the family if you're working from home for a little bit of time, right? Life is not served and work is not served by trying to defend every hour of a 9 to 6 working day. So I think it's also this very useful lesson in terms of like, yes, use whatever autonomy you have to control and ring fence this kind of amount of time. But don't imagine that you can control much more than that. And don't imagine that you'd even want to, right? Because that's not the way that the best work is done. So, a lot of these examples do borrow, of course, from my own experiences as a writer. But I do try very hard to keep sort of 4 to 5 hours of a day free, not because I'm going to do 5 hours of amazingly productive writing, but because within that I might do 3.5. And then I'm just like, okay, the rest of it is going to be fragmented, both fragmented in terms of the work that I'm doing and fragmented between work and other stuff, parenting, life. And then I don't feel frustrated that it turns out that way, right? I don't spend the whole of my afternoons in a kind of war against reality, because that's what reality is, and I'm sort of basically glad of it. I think that's really sort of useful advice for anyone doing kind of focused knowledge work.
I think it's an honest realization, at least for me it was, that yes, I might be at a desk for that many hours, but if you really looked at the hours that I would say they really mattered, and if I'm honest about it, I think it's hard to count more than 3 or 4 per day. And I might be available and doing things the rest of the day, but if you ask about the highest value added, I think 3 and 4, it's the honest answer. So it really resonated with me. I want to ask you about something you bring up that I really like. You said you call it the upside of the unpredictability. And we've been talking about the future. And usually when people think about the future, it's the bad things happening. But there are some good things kept happening that are unpredictable. Can you talk about that upside of things that we didn't expect?
Yeah, there's a German thinker called Hartmut Rosa whose ideas definitely inform this book, who talks about how, on some level it is the fundamental dynamic of our civilization to try to exert more and more control over reality. And yet we find again and again that at a certain point, exerting too much control over reality actually robs it of what he calls the resonance the vibrancy that makes it really feel like worth living. And one of the places where I think this becomes very obvious is when you think about sort of unpredictability. There's this quote that I cite, which is that almost everything in life is either a good time or a good story. So a lot of experiences, not all of them, there are just tragedies that happen to people, 100%. But a lot of the time, either life goes as you wanted it to go, or it didn't, and you're kind of glad that it did, and you sort of dine out on the anecdote, or it turns into something fascinating and interesting, and or you laugh about it in hindsight. I interviewed a lot of people in the Guardian for quite a few years when I was working at the Guardian. I did interviews with sometimes celebrities, authors, people like that. And if you ask someone to sort of recount the critical moments in their biography, and this would be true for me if I were to do this as well, like the turning points, the things that sort of allowed them to become who they were, or when they met their partner, or when they sort of made the contact that led them to the professional success that they've enjoyed, or something like that. It's always something they didn't plan, right? It's always something that they could not have made happen by deciding that it was going to happen. And I think there's a really important lesson there about how much control we ought to seek from the future. And I think most of us can intuit, right? That if it's purely a thought experiment, but if you knew exactly how every moment of your life from now until your death was going to unfold, that would be a bit like already being dead. Like, something would be completely missing from that is very fundamental to how we live. So anyway, practical terms, I think this is a reason for worrying a bit less and unclenching a little bit, and being a bit more okay with the fact that you don't really know what the next month or year is going to bring, because a lot of the time it brings things that you're glad it brought.
So something that seems undesirable in the moment can actually lead to something much more desirable down the road. And then there's so many opportunities that we're not aware of. And you're right that looking back, I think all of us can share some stories where some event took us in a completely different, unexpected direction.
Right.
That was much better than we thought, but we had no real direct control over being in the room with the right person, being at an event, or sending an email that led to some opportunity.
Yeah. And it's a great sort of, sorry, I was just going to say, it's a great reason for the anxious among us to just sort of chill out a little bit. You know this very famous, I think it's a Taoist story about the, I'll be quick, don't worry. You can cut it out. About it's a Taoist story about a farmer whose horse escapes, and the rest of the village say, "I'm very sorry, your horse escaped," and he says, that's a terrible thing for you. And he says, "We'll see." And then the next day, the next month or something, the horse comes back with several other horses that it's found in the wild. And they say, "How wonderful, now you have many more horses." And he says, "No, we'll see." And then his son, learning to ride the horse, breaks his leg falling from the horse. And they all say, "Well, that's terrible for you." And the farmer says, "We'll see." And then the next week, the army comes through, taking all the sons of the village off to war, but they don't take him because he's broken his leg, so he gets to stay. And everyone says, "That's wonderful for you." And the farmer says, "We'll see." And, it never ends,
Story goes
right?
on.
You never know. There's not a final judgment on anything, ever.
There is so much truth to it in everyday life. And then in the investment world, when you buy a stock, you can't predict all the opportunities that this business will have over the next few decades. When you think of technology companies like Microsoft 40 years ago, who knew that they would become so big, so successful, global, with so many products? That cloud computing will happen, internet and phones in our pockets and so on, right? So this upside of unpredictability really speaks to me on just everyday life level, but also in the investment field. And then the cool part is that when you buy a share in a company, you don't have to know exactly all of those things. You just have to be directionally right, that you're on the right boat, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But where it will take you, relax about it a little bit. I think people are too obsessed. Their price targets and all those ideas in the investment space where you have to know for sure that this is a $50 stock. Well, right. Listen to Oliver. He told us about the upside of unpredictability. I want to ask you about two kinds of impossible that you write about in the book. And I think, we were talking about tasks, productivity. There are some things we face or we run into or we want to reach for that seem impossible. And you break it up into two different experiences.
I think it's an obvious immediate pushback to some of the things I go around writing and talking about, to say, if we didn't aim for impossible things, then so many human achievements wouldn't have been accomplished, right? It's like, wasn't the iPhone the result of dreaming of something impossible? Wasn't the moon landing the example of, on and on and on? And it's a sort of it's an understandable pushback, but I do think there's basically a semantic disagreement here. I am saying that we should relax our efforts to do things that are kind of systematically impossible for human beings to do, right? So ever more, to process ever greater numbers of tasks simply through efficiency measures, or to, to avoid the trade-offs that come with all the decisions that we have to make about time at all points. This is not the same as saying, you shouldn't be incredibly ambitious for what you can do with your time. In fact, I think it's the key to being incredibly ambitious to what you can do with your time. And I don't know enough about the details of, the life of Steve Jobs or the people who worked on the moon landings, but I suspect that research would persuade you that an ability to not be distracted into 1,000 other things, an ability to concentrate on the things that they had decided to concentrate on and to let go of the other things. I mean, I think I do know that about Steve Jobs' approach to business strategy, actually. But, the willingness to let go of these kind of impossible quests, like be infinitely capable of responding instantly to every email, is directly associated with the possibility of doing the really interesting thing, writing the path-breaking book or the invention or the medical breakthrough. And the idea that the phrase that I use for this is it's like a Quebecois French phrase, not a particularly popular saying, but one that somebody from there sort of recalled their grandmother using, which was "C'est fait pas du monde," which is very roughly translated as, people did that. If you look around at anything that you see in the world, anything that is the most impressive thing, the thing you admire the most, the creation, the cultural object, the scientific breakthrough, like these were all just done by flawed and finite people just like you. Doesn't mean you can do anything, right? You probably shouldn't be performing surgery if you have not trained as a surgeon, right? You can't. If you can't fly a plane, you can't fly a plane. But the basic point, right? There is no reason in your own professional field to look at somebody else and say, oh, that's just a different kind of person. They just sort of belong to some kind of superior stratum of ability, right? Everybody is capable of being in one place at a time. Everybody needs at least some sleep. The probably advantages do accrue to that minority of people who can get by on 4 hours, but everybody gets tired if they work for long enough. We're all just in this boat together, and that's actually a very empowering vision, because it makes you realize that you could just take a few bold and ambitious choices right now.
When I read it, I was thinking that some things that seem impossible, the thing you point out, that a lot of them have been done, and they've been done by people. So whether you have to acquire the skill or experience or expertise, you could potentially do it too. It's very encouraging, very empowering. Moon landing, I think that's something that we had to do as a species for the first time. Nobody has done it.
Right.
We actually haven't flown to the moon and landed successfully in a while. I think there's a whole topic to explore. Your books talk about mortals, and I really like the word. And it's a reminder that our life is finite. But for a minute or two, if you indulge me, and it's a question that I've been pondering for a while. When I run into a wall, a problem, I try to approach it from a completely different direction. So when we say our life is finite, can we imagine for a second, you and I, my audience, we're the lucky ones, we actually happen to be immortal. We could live forever. Let's say we stop aging at this point and we have unlimited time. how do you think that would change our approach to all the problems we've been talking about for the last hour?
It's a fascinating question. It has been, dealt with by various philosophers through history, and of course it intersects with certain kinds of religious belief that, in some sense, we do live forever. Although the more sophisticated of those tend to not mean just the linear extension of life, right? It's something different and more mysterious. Well, first of all, I want to say that I think that if we just managed to extend life by like 100 years, grateful as I would be for that, like I would take that pill if it was healthy life, I think all the problems we've talked about would just reassert themselves at a different level, right? So it's like
Right.
now it would be that would still seem like insultingly short a period of time after a few generations had passed. Not everyone agrees with me, but I think that if we could, on some level, solve death completely and life just stretched on forever, that this would be hell.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there are plenty of people who think that this is, well, maybe not plenty, but there's certainly a contingent of people who think that this is a kind of an insane thing to say. Like, I would obviously like to eradicate poverty. I would obviously like to eradicate murder. I would obviously like to eradicate, the extremes of depression. So why would I not, and terrible diseases. So why do I make an exception for like dying of old age? Why is that a good thing? And it's a difficult question and a real challenge. And I don't know that I have the answer. But what I do think is that if life stretched on forever, it would feel meaningless. I think that I do think in quite a sort of rigorous sense you can say that death gives meaning to life, because one way of putting it is that if we live forever, then the answer to the question, should I do this today or should I do this other thing today? How should I spend the next year of my life? Would always be like, who cares, right? Nothing's at stake. Nothing will be at stake. There's a lovely book by called This Life by the philosopher whose name I'm blanking on right now. How embarrassing. Anyway, it's called This Life, and it's a very, very interesting account of the sort of value that life gets from not continuing forever. And then he turns it into a fascinating political argument for it's a sort of argument for democratic socialism. That's what he does with that book. But as the first half of it, before he gets political, is a very interesting treatment of this notion that the fleetingness of experience is why it's precious. We should not want to live forever, therefore making every single experience kind of valueless, right? Because, this is just a basic economics point about scarcity, right? Experience would not be scarce. There would be nothing to treasure about the things that we chose to do, because we could just do all the other ones every millennium forever.
And I put a subtle twist on it, because in a way, I feel like we live as if we were immortal, as if we had unlimited tomorrows, as if there was always time to go on that trip, or, get the pet, or go for that walk, or whatever it is, or see the opera, whatever you enjoy, or read that book. And in a way, we are aware that we're mortal, but we're almost living as if there was an unlimited number of tomorrows. And maybe in a way we lose respect for the fact that those weeks, as you counted them in one of your books, they are limited. There's only that many. So I don't know, but I think your books remind us that there's a limit. But I think the danger is that we might be living our lives without remembering that there's only that many weeks and that many tomorrows.
I think that's really well put. So yes, to the extent that we sort of, with our bodies, live as if we believed we lived forever, even if we intellectually understand that's not true, to that extent do we put ourselves in that situation of life not having the meaning and the richness that it could? Do we sort of emulate the person who, the hypothetical person who lives indefinitely? On some level, we just sort of have to navigate through life and not be totally overwhelmed by fear of mortality, right? I think there's, to some extent, a little bit of denial is probably part of, it just sort of comes with the territory. But I do think that leaning more away from that and more into understanding the finitude of life is basically very powerful and adds richness and meaning to life. I think it's easily possible to misunderstand this as an argument for sort of trying to cram as many extraordinary experiences into every single second of the day as you can. And that, of course, is not it. What it is this kind of idea that, Japanese culture is particularly eloquent about, I think, but we can all access it. This kind of poignancy, right? This kind of almost a sadness that comes from the fact that we're just here for a while and then it will go. But the sort of sadness that actually, or wistfulness, maybe that's the right word, that actually draws you deeper into life. So yeah, it is kind of tragic that we have to make these trade-offs, but it's the kind of tragicness or tragedy that the embrace of it really makes me feel more alive. It's not something that I would just like to get rid of because it's depressing. It's a real sort of alive feeling. It's not totally happy, but it's really alive.
So for 1 minute, practicing a bit of lateral thinking. When people talk about time and money, they say time is money, money is time. So for a second, let's assume that they have you can learn from one when you're thinking about the other. So human life is limited. Let's say you can live to 100, 120. But with wealth, you could have so much wealth that you can't even imagine spending it in a lifetime. Right. We know people that have hundreds of billions these days around the globe. So you could think, how do they think about this kind of wealth that exceeds the daily or weekly or monthly budgeting that a lot of us have to experience to have the last $100, £100 to pay the bills? Yeah. They don't think about it, right? So it's almost like somebody that could have unlimited time. They have unlimited wealth. You would think that they lose respect for that money. It's unlimited. But they actually earn this peculiar respect for that wealth because they don't want to lose it. So my thought is that if we do have that unlimited time, we actually might have this renewed respect for what time is. So if you said, Bogomil, you're going to live forever, I'm not going to take a minimum wage job because I can live forever and earn $1,000 working in the least paying job. I'd like to think of how am I going to use this time now that I have it? And maybe I have this renewed respect for this time. And I will spend the time to get the skills and experience to get the most per hour, if that's the way to earn money, instead of trying to waste it away. I don't know. Whenever I ask this question, the first thought a lot of people have is, since it's unlimited, I'm going to start wasting it. And then after a second, they realize, I actually don't want to waste it. I know I have unlimited time. I don't want to waste it. I don't know. But the more I think about it, yeah.
No, it's fascinating. And you might be right. I'd have to think about that more. One thing that does occur to me, and I'm just sort of speculating, of course, about what it would be like for me if I had hundreds of billions of dollars, is that I think that at a certain level of scale, I imagine that at least some people, maybe not everybody, but at least some people relating to that kind of a fortune do fairly quickly, maybe at a much lower level of high wealth, begin to see it less as theirs and more as something that they are stewarding through the world. And I think there's something very powerful there in terms of understanding that time is not this kind of little store of resource that we get to make decisions about, but it's actually something that, we get to live through. And we get to live through with other people and for future generations. And there is this, I think there might be, I feel like if I was insanely wealthy, the way that I would make it sane for myself was thinking of it as no longer like just something for me to try to maximize. It would be something to try to help steward into the future in the most effective ways, whether that's by spending it or by...
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. One last thought on that front, and I have one last question, and I'm going to let you fly away, but I was thinking about the consequences. So since our lifetime is limited, and we think of, for example, what we're doing to the planet, and just for a second to explore it, and you say, well, in my lifetime, this won't be an issue. But if you were to live on this planet forever, and it's the only planet you can live on, and you're going to live, 10,000 years, you start to pay attention to some things more, I would think, right? You would realize, listen, I'll be here to see the consequences of it.
Yeah, maybe. And this is something that people, I don't know if it's true for me that becoming a parent has made me more concerned for the future state of the world. That's obviously a bit of a cliche that people use. But again, I would almost want to say, well, I think you've got a really good point, but also, like, why do I have to be around for this to matter? What about all the other people? So it's there's something very interesting here about stepping out of the sort of narrow boundaries of the self, but that is a whole other conversation and probably multiple other books. Yeah.
Oliver, one last question. What's your definition of success?
Well, I could answer that as sort of functionally speaking, how I actually go through life feeling successful or not. And then I probably do still carry with me at least some of the burden of thinking that success is fulfilling all my obligations, and success is putting in all the effort and being maximally judicious about the future and all the kind of pathologies that we've been discussing in this hour. If you're asking my sort of what I would like, how I would define the success that I would like to have my life defined by, I think it has to ultimately be showing up as fully as I was able for as much of it as I was able, like really being here.
As we were, you and I, for this 1 hour. Oliver, thank you so much. 2 wonderful books. I recommend reading both. And I enjoyed rereading them, and I'll keep going back to them because I feel like there are so many lessons that I will find relevant throughout my lifetime. And it's easy to forget the respect that we need to have for the fact that our time here is finite, as much as we can dream up for a minute about an immortal life that might be possible at some point, but it's not at this moment. Oliver, thank you so much for today.
Thank you. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation.
You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show. One click for you means the world to us. Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogumił Baranowski.